I survived the siege of Leningrad for months without and no one could have imagined what happened next. The silence, when it finally came, wasn't a relief. It was a scream. A scream so vast and hollow that it swallowed the sound of my own bones creaking as I dragged myself over the frozen rubble. For 872 days, the world had been a symphony of metal tearing through the sky, of explosions that shook the earth, and of wails that the wind carried like deadly. Now, the only sound was my breath, a ghostly vapor that condensed and froze almost instantly in the still air. The air smelled of brick dust, dirty snow, and a sickly sweetness I had learned to ignore lest I go mad. It was the smell of death preserved by the coal. In that instant, however, amid the deafening silence of liberation, my hand, more like animal claws than human hand, encountered something that was not stone, nor wood, nor ice. It was smooth, cold in a different way, and when I pulled him from that tomb of rubble, my heart, a forgotten and weak muscle, gave a single painful. It wasn't food. It wasn't a weapon. It was something infinitely heavier. The world round me was a grey skeleton. Buildings, once full of life, music, and the smell of baking bread, were now nothing more than broken teeth pointing at an indifferent sky. Snow fell softly, a pure white shroud covering the filth and suffering. I stood, or rather, hunched over, in what had once been a bakery on Nevsky Prospect. For months, the ghost of that place's bready smell had been my torture and my only hope. I dreamed of it. I hallucinated about it. Now, the place was just a hole in the ground, a gaping wound in the city. The cold was no longer an enemy. It was part of it. It ran through my veins along with my thin, sluggish blood. I no longer felt it on my skin, but in my soul. It was an existential cold, the cold of complete abandonment by God and man. My fingers, purple and swollen, barely responded to my command. But they dug. They dug with the memory of strength, with the stubbornness of an insect that refuses to die. Every movement was a negotiation with death. The body, after so many months at its absolute limit, learned to conserve every spark of energy. Breathing, an involuntary act, became a conscious effort. Blinking seemed a waste. My stomach no longer growled. It was a silent crater, a vacuum sucking my own muscles inward. Hunger had become a living entity within me, a parasite that had devoured the man I was, leaving only a shell. I didn't think about family, love, or the future. These were luxuries of a world that no longer existed. My universe was reduced to the next step, the next breath, the next piece of rubble to be turned over. The search wasn't for bread or frozen potato. It was too late for that. What drove me was a darker impulse, a need born of absolute desperation that only those who have stared into the abyss for too long can understand. And then I felt it, a metallic, rectangular shape beneath my injured fingertip. The sound it made as it dragged against the gravel was obscene in that silence. A clear, real noise in a world of ghosts. With an effort that made carnations dance before my eyes, I unearthed it. It was a small metal box, perhaps for biscuits or tea, pre-war. It was rusted round the edges, but surprisingly intact. It wasn't heavy. The weight I felt wasn't in its physical content, but in its implication. Why was it there, so carefully buried beneath the remains of the place that symbolized life itself, bread? With trembling hand, I forced the lid. It gave way with a metallic groan, and what I saw inside made all the horror of the siege, all the hunger, all the fear, seem like nothing more than a preface. My scream caught in my throat, a knot of ice and dread. The world stopped spinning. There, in that box, lay Leningrad's most terrible and human secret. A secret that explained how some people managed to survive when all others perished. The siege had broken my body, but it was what I found in that moment, in that deafening silence, that began to break my soul. And to understand the weight of that secret in my trembling hand, you must return with me. Return to the time when I was still a man, and not just a hungry ghost walking among the dead. You must know who I was before war forced me to discover what a human being is capable of when everything is taken from them. Yes, to understand the weight of that secret, you need to see me as I was before. Not this old man sitting in a creaky armchair, with his hands stained by time and his breath shallow. Close your eyes and try to see. Try to see Dmitri. Dmitri Volkov, a 19-year-old boy, tall from eye, with more hair than sense, and an easy smile that irritated my younger sister. Today, I am 93. The city outside is no longer called Leningrad, and children run through the streets without looking up in fear. They don't know the sound of the siren, the air raid alarm, which infiltrates their dreams and turns their blood twice. To them, it's just St. Petersburg. But for me, on silent nights like this, the old name always returns, whispered by the wind that hits my window. And with it, the image of that boy, Dmitri, who believed in a future as bright as the golden spires of the Admiralty. I wasn't a soldier, not in the sense of carrying a rifle and digging trenches on the front line. My uniform wasn't Red Army uniform, but thick overalls and heavy gloves. My weapons were a shovel, a sand bucket, and a metal grappling hook. I was part of the Civilian Fire Brigade, the MPVO. I was assigned to the rooftop team of my own building. When the sirens wailed, especially at night, instead of running to the underground shelters with my mother and sister, I went upstairs. I climbed the creaking stairs, step by step, my heart hammering against my ribs, up into the frigid air of the rooftop. And there, with the entire city stretched out below me like a map of pain, I waited. We waited for Thelitis, the German incendiary bomb. They fell by the thousand, small and terrifyingly effective, designed not to explode but to burn, to devour our city from the inside out. Our job was to extinguish them before they could nest in the dry wood of our attics and turn our homes into funeral pyres. We picked up the bombs with long metal tongs and dipped them into barrels of water, or covered them with sand until they suffocated. It was a strange job, almost intimate with the enemy. I held in my hands the weapon that had come to destroy, and for a brief moment I was its master. But before that, before the smell of matches and the soot that never left my fingernail, there was another life. A life so ordinary it's painful to remember. Our apartment was small, but the afternoon sun always found its way through the kitchen window, illuminating the jars of raspberry jam my mother, Elena, made in the summer. She was a woman with steady hands and a hug that smelled of bread and security. My father, Ivan, worked at the Kira factory, building the tractors that would soon be replaced by tanks. At night, he taught me to play chess, moving the wooden pieces with a patience I never managed. Every piece has a purpose. Dima, he would say. Even the humblest pawn can decide the game. Never underestimate anyone. I didn't know he was teaching me about life itself. And then there was Anya, my sister. At 12, she was a whirlwind of blonde braids and endless questions. She collected stamps and dreamed of being a ballerina at the Mariinsky Theater. Her laughter was the soundtrack to our home. Me. I wanted to be an architect. Leningrad was my textbook. I spent hours walking along the banks of the Neva River, sketching in a worn notebook the facade of the Hermitage Museum, the graceful curve of a bridge, the imposing dome of St. Isaac's Cathedral. I loved the symmetry, the strength, and the beauty of that city. I thought nothing in the world could bring it down. I had plans. I would go to university, become a great architect, build even more beautiful buildings. In the summer of 1940, I was in love. Her name was Kotya. She had eyes the color of the sky before a storm, and she worked in the public library. We walked during the white night, when the sun had barely set and the world seemed bathed in a magical, silvery light. We talked about poetry, about the future, about everything and nothing. The war was something that happened far away, in the newspaper, in radio broadcast. It was background noise, not the real threat. We were young. We were invincible. We believed the future was a long, paved road waiting for us. When war came in June, there was still this sense of invincibility. We will wipe the fascists from the face of the earth, shouted the enlisting. In 3 weeks we will be in Berlin. I enlisted in the civil defense, proud to be able to protect my city, my building, my family. The first bombings were terrifying, but also exhilarating. There was a strange camaraderie on the rooftop, under a sky dotted with anti-aircraft fire. We were the guardians of Leningrad. But then, in September, the rain closed. The roads, the railways, everything was cut off. The city became a stone island in an ocean of enemy army. And hunger, an enemy far more cruel than any bomb, began to creep under the doors. At first, it was merely an inconvenience. Bread rations shrank. The soup became thinner. But we still had our reserves, our hope. We believed in the speeches, in the strength of the Red Army. We believed the suffering would be brief. But naivete is the first thing war kills. And it began killing us long before the bombs or the famine. It began with the first humiliation, a small cut in the soul that would soon become an incurable wound. That wound to my soul, that first humiliation, didn't come from a German bomb or a soldier's bayonet. It came from the hands of a compatriot, in a bread line, on a grey, biting November day in 1940. Winter hadn't yet shown its true face, but it was already growling at the edges of the city, blowing a wind from Lake Ladoga that seemed to carry icy needles. It was the first time I went to collect the bread ration with Anya. My father was on a 48-hour shift at the factory, and my mother, already weakened by a cough that wouldn't go away, urged me to go. Be strong for your sister, Dima, she said, handing me the ration cup, which already seemed like relics of a time of plenty. I felt important, the man of the house, a protector. What a fool I was. The line stretched for 2 blocks. A silent, grey snake of bodies huddled against the coal. No one spoke. The sound of the city was the shuffling of footsteps in the dirty snow and the whizzing of the wind between the bombed-out buildings. Conserving energy was the supreme law. Talking was an unnecessary waste. Anya held my hand, the small woolen glove already worn on her finger. She didn't complain. No child complained anymore. They had aged decades in a matter of weeks. Their eyes, large and serious in small, pale faces, watched everything with a terrible understanding. We waited for 3 hours. 3 hours standing, the cold creeping up through the soles of our shoes, seeping into my bone. With each shuffling step forward, hope and anxiety grew. The bread, that small, miserable 125-gram square, dark, damp, made more of sawdust and seed meal than flour, was the sun on which our lives now. It was the only reason to leave the house, to face the cold, to keep breathing. When we finally reached the distribution window, I could barely feel my feet. The woman inside had a face like it had been carved from frozen wood. Her eyes were small and devoid of any emotion. She was just a cog in the machine of survival. I handed her our cards. She took them with a quick, mechanical movement, inspected them, and took my portion of bread. But when she looked at Enya's card, she stopped. She frowned. There was a small spot of moisture in the corner, where a snowflake had melted. "This one's damaged," she said, her voice flat and lifeless. "I can't accept it." My heart sank. "It's just a little water," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Please, it's my sister's. She's 12. The woman didn't even glance at Anya, who cowered behind me. "The rules are clear. Damaged cards are not valid." Next, panic began to rise in my throat, cold and bitter. But we waited for hours. "It was an accident. Look at her," I pleaded, my voice rising, breaking the silent discipline of the line. Behind me, I heard a murmur of impatience. "Hurry up, boy. We all have problems. We don't have all day." Desperation turned to shame. I was making a scene. I was exposing my pain, my need, and in return, I received only the cold indifference of collective misery. They weren't cruel. They were just hungry, just like me. Compassion was a luxury no one else could afford. The woman pushed my piece of bread toward me. "Take yours and leave. You're holding up the line." I looked at the piece of bread in my hand. It felt like the dirtiest, most disgusting object in the world. I looked at the woman's impassive face, and then I looked at Anya. It was her gaze that broke me. There were no tears. There was no anger. There was only quiet acceptance, a terrible wisdom in her childlike eyes. She understood. She understood that rules were no longer meaningful, that justice was a forgotten word. She tugged lightly on my hand, a small signal for us to leave. And in that moment, all my pride, all my sense of being a protector, crumbled. I had failed. I hadn't gotten what was rightfully hers. I couldn't protect her from a small stain of water and the inhuman bureaucracy of hunger. I grabbed my bread and turned away from the window, feeling dozens of hungry eyes on my back. The walk home was the longest of my life. The silence between Anya and me was heavier than any artillery. She didn't let go of my hand, and that simple gesture of trust was like a knife twisting in my chest. When we entered our apartment, the faint heat from the makeshift stove felt like a mockery. My mother looked at my hand, saw only a loaf of bread, and knew immediately. I didn't need to say anything. I saw the pain on her face, but she quickly hid it. She didn't blame me. She never would. Instead, she took the small piece of bread, went to the table. With the knife she used to peel potatoes in another life, cut it into 3 equal pieces. "We'll eat together," she said, with a simplicity that was devastating. I couldn't eat. The lump in my throat was too tight. Pushed my portion toward Anya. That night, lying in my bed, listening to my mother's dry cough in the other room and the sound of the wind howling like a hungry wolf, I felt the true nature of the siege for the first time. It wasn't a heroic battle. It was a slow, methodical stripping away of her humanity. It was the shame of not being able to care for her own. It was the indignity of being reduced to an animal begging for scrap. That night, the hunger in my stomach was nothing compared to the hole shame had dug in my chest. I thought I had hit rock bottom of human dignity. I was wrong. That wasn't the bottom. It was merely the gateway. Winter was coming, and with it came a kind of horror our minds still refused to fathom. A horror that crept slowly through the frozen street, transforming our city into a white, silent hell. That white, silent hell I feared was just the prologue. The true horror didn't scream. It seeped in. It arrived with the first real frost, which didn't melt by noon. It arrived with the blackening of the window, when the government ordered us to cover all the glass with black paper to thwart the night bombers, plunging the city into perpetual night even as the midday sun shone dimly outside. That small act, that surrender to the darkness, changed everything. Our apartments ceased to be homes and became dark, icy caves where we huddled like frightened animals, listening to the world outside die. The winter of 1941-1942 wasn't a season. It was a weapon, more effective than any tank division. Temperatures dropped to 30, then 40 degrees below zero. The world became fragile. Wood creaked, metal groaned, and breath turned into a cloud of ice crystals that seemed to loud in the oppressive stillness. The city's water pipes froze and burst. Water became yet another resource to be hunted. Every morning, a new silent procession formed, women and children dragging buckets and pots toward the Neva River, where they dug holes in the thick ice to obtain a supply of gray, polluted water. Many, weakened by hunger, slipped on the ice and lacked the strength to stand, simply freezing to death just meters from the water that would have given them another day of life. Electricity was the next to die. The city plunged into a primitive darkness. The only light came from the flickering flames of makeshift lamps made from tin cans and a little machine oil, which released a greasy black smoke that stained the walls, the ceiling. The darkness was total, physical and spiritual. It was a darkness that allowed fear to grow unchecked, that transformed every creak of the building into a signal of collapse, every cough into a harbinger of death. And the hunger. Oh, the hunger. The humiliation I felt in the bread line became an almost nostalgic memory. The bread ration was cut again and again. It reached 125 grams for workers like me, and even less for the other. It was a block the size of a bar of soap, made of things that shouldn't be eaten. We divided it with surgical precision, crumb by crumb. But it wasn't enough to keep a body alive. So we began eating the unthinkable. We boiled leather belts and old wallets until they turned into a quivering, inedible jelly. We scraped wallpaper off the walls to boil the potato glue underneath, creating a white, viscous soup. We ate the contents of first aid kit, the petroleum jelly, the castor oil. We boiled pine needles to get some vitamin C and ward off scurvy. Food became an obsession that drowned out all other thought. Conversations were no longer about the future or the past, but about imaginary recipe, the texture of a baked potato, the smell of cabbage soup. They were the prayers of a religion in which hunger was the only god. My job as a firefighter gave me a front row seat to the apocalypse. While most people hid in their dark lairs, I was out there on the surface of that dying planet. Each night, The sirens howled, and we climbed onto the frozen rooftop. The city ablaze under an Arctic sky was a sight that burned into our memory. Fire was the only warm thing in that icy world. The red and orange glow of the flames dancing against the white snow, the black smoke rising in thick columns into the starry sky. There was a terrible, hypnotic beauty to it. But up close, it was just hell. The water in our hoses froze. We had to use axes to break the ice inside them, wasting precious. The vapor from the water we threw on the flames froze in the air, falling on us like a rain of glass. Our coats became armor of ice, heavy and unyielding. And the smell of ancient wood burning, of fabric, of books turning to ash, and beneath a sickening, sweet smell that, at first, I didn't recognize. It was the smell of burning human flesh. People unable or unwilling to leave their apartment, consumed by the fire we came to fight. Death ceased to be an event. It became part of the urban landscape. In early December, the first bodies appeared in the street. People who simply lost energy, fell into the snow, and never got up. At first, passers-by stopped, stared, perhaps made the sign of the cross. Within a few weeks, no one looked anymore. We passed them as if they were ice statues, part of the rubble. The city no longer had the resources to bury its dead. Cemeteries became mounds of frozen bodies, stacked like cordwood, awaiting the spring thaw. The most frightening image, the one that truly symbolized our condition, was that of the little sled. Children, people used them for everything, to carry water, firewood, and finally, to carry their dead. It was common to see a woman, thin as a skeleton, pulling a sled through the snow, and on the sled, a small bundle wrapped in a sheet or blanket. She didn't cry. There were no more tears, no more energy from mourning. There was only one task, the last service to a father, a mother, a child, to drag him to the nearest collection point so that he would not be left at home. I saw it every day on my way to my post, and I got used to it. That's the most terrible part. Humans get used to everything. We get used to bomb. We get used to the cold. We even get used to the sight of frozen corpses on the sidewalk. But there's one sound the human mind can never accept, a sound I heard one January night that broke something inside me forever. And it's toward that sound that this story is heading. You'll understand what I mean when you hear the sound that still echoes in my dream. That sound proved that, no matter how much we tried to numb ourselves, no matter how much we hid behind the routine of survival, we were still human. And being human meant we could still have our hearts ripped from our chests. Mass horror has a strange effect. It numbs you. You see so much suffering that your heart covers itself with a shell of ice to survive. I was becoming one of those grey figures I saw on the street, a functioning ghost, focused only on the next siren, the next loaf of bread, on keeping my mother and Anya alive. Love and fear for them were the only embers still burning beneath the ashes of my soul. I thought suffering was like an artillery bombardment, impersonal, random, coming from afar. But war is smarter. It's seriously dotted weight. And when you think you can't feel anything anymore, when you think you've seen the worst the world has to offer, it finds a way to remind you that you still have a soul. Just so it can rip it to shreds before your eyes. And that's exactly what happened that frozen night, when hell decided to stop being a landscape and become an intimate, personal event. That functional ghost I was becoming, the icy shell that had formed round my heart, melted and shattered in a single night, in the depths of that endless winter. It was January 1942, the coldest and deadliest month of the entire sea. The city had become a mausoleum, but in our smaller part, that, for a brief, fragile moment, we found refuge. The three of us, my mother, Eleanor, my sister and I, we were huddled round our bazooka, the small metal greenhouse that was our black sun, devouring the last pages of a Dostoevsky novel and the leg of a broken chair to give us miserable warmth. There was no food to cook. The heat was only to keep the blood flowing, to ward off the stiffness of death for a few more hours. Outside, the city was quiet, too exhausted even to grow. The bombardment had subsided in recent days, as if even the enemy were frozen. My mother, thinner than I'd ever seen her, with dark bruises under her eye, was mending one of my gloves with a piece of thread she'd unraveled from the hem of an old dress. Her every movement was slow, deliberate. Anya sat beside me, wrapped in the only woolen blanket we had left. She was silent. It had been weeks since I'd heard her laugh. Hunger steals that first, the energy for joy. To try to break the spell of apathy, I began to recite a Pushkin poem I'd learned in school, about autumn, about golden fields and the melancholy beauty of nature. My voice sounded strange and high in the stillness. Anya rested her head on my shoulder. Her body was so light, she felt like a bird. "I don't like autumn," she whispered, her voice little more than a breath. "I like spring. When the ice on the Neva River breaks, it makes a thunderous noise. Remember, Dima?" I remembered. The sound of ice breaking in spring was the sound of life returning to Leningrad. "Yes, Anyushka," I said, stroking her thinning hair. "Spring will come, and we will watch the ice break together." It was a promise, the last I would make to her. And then the sound began. The siren. But this time, it wasn't a distant wail. It seemed to be screaming right above our roof. Almost immediately, the sky exploded. The city's anti-aircraft artillery opened fire with a fury I had never heard. The Germans were attacking in force. The floor of our fourth-floor apartment shook. Chunks of plaster fell from the ceiling. My mother dropped her glove. "To the hallway," she shouted. But there was no time. We heard the whistle. That sound I mentioned. The sound the mind refuses to accept. It's not the sound of a bomb exploding in the distance. It's the sound of it coming toward you. A shriek that tears through the air, growing from a high-pitched buzz to a deafening scream in a matter of seconds. It's the sound of your name being called by death. Time stretches. Every fraction of a second lasts an hour. I threw myself over Anya, trying to shield her with my body, and saw my mother's face turn toward us, her mouth open in a silent scream that was swallowed by the detonation. There was no fiery explosion. There was an impact, a colossal punch that struck the entire building. And then, only darkness, the deafening roar of 1,000 years of brick and wood disintegrate, and the sensation of falling into a bottomless abyss. I woke up choking. Plaster dust filled my mouth, my nose, my lungs. The silence was absolute, but my ears were ringing so loudly it hurt. I didn't know where I was. Everything was darkness and heaviness. Something heavy was on my back, but my arms and head were free, in a small pocket of air. It took me minutes to understand. The building had collapsed. I was alive, buried alive. Panic, cold and electric, hit me. I screamed, "Mom, Anya." My voice was absorbed by the mass of rubble. No sound returned. I began digging with my hand, aimlessly, in a frenzy of desperation. My nails broke. My fingertips bled, but the pain was a distant. I called out again and again, their names becoming a hoarse mantra. And then I heard it. A faint moan, coming from somewhere below me. "Dima." It was her voice, Anya. She was alive. A wave of relief and wild strength washed over me. "Anya, I'm here. I'm coming for you." I began digging toward the sound, throwing pieces of wood and brick aside. "Keep talking, Anyushka. Where are you?" "It's dark," her small voice replied, muffled. "And my leg hurts. I can't move." I know. I'll get you out of here. Just don't fall asleep." I found a larger space and managed to move, sliding deeper into the rubble. I could hear her more clearly now. She was close, so close. "Sing to me, Dima," she urged, her voice trembling. "Sing that song, the one about the boat sailing on the river." Then I sang. In a tomb of dust and darkness, I sang a lullaby about boats and sunlit rivers, my voice breaking into sobs as my hands tore at the wreckage. Finally, my fingers touched something, a wooden beam, and beneath it, I felt the fabric of her coat. "I'm here," I cried, joy choking. But then my hand found the obstacle, a slab of concrete, solid and cold. Most of the ceiling of our bedroom. She was trapped beneath it. I pushed. I screamed with effort. The slab didn't budge an inch. It was a monument to my failure. "Dima, I'm cold." Her voice was weaker now. The panic returned, tenfold. No. Hold on, Anya. Help is coming." I screamed for help, for anyone. My voice lost in the wreckage. No one answered. We were alone. "I can't breathe properly," she gasped. And then came the sound. The true sound that haunts me. It wasn't a scream, not a sob. It was the soft, terrible sound of her lungs giving out. A small, shaky inhale, followed by an even smaller a breath, like the blowing out of a candle. And then silence. A silence that was a physical object, pressing in on me from all sides, filling my ears, my soul. "Anya," I whispered. "Anyushka, sing with me." The silence, and I understood. She was gone, just inches from my fingers. In that silence, beneath the rubble of my own home, the boy named Dmitri died. What emerged hours later, found by a rescue team, was something else, a hollow ghost, driven only by instinct and the memory of that last breath. I had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous thing in a war zone. I didn't know it then, but the war was about to give me an opportunity to prove this theory. In the midst of the largest and most desperate operation to break the siege, the Sinyavino offensive, the ghost that emerged from the rubble of my building in January no longer felt the cold, no longer felt the hunger. For months, I operated like a machine. I continued my work in the fire brigade, climbing rooftops, extinguishing incendiary. But my spirit was miles away, frozen in a silence nothing could penetrate. I ate my ration of bread without tasting, drank the thin soup without feeling the heat. I saw death every day and felt nothing. It was other people's pain, other families' mourning. Mine was already over. Then, in the summer of 1942, the rumors began. Whispers of a major offensive, a massive attempt to break the siege once and for all. The Red Army was amassing troops on the other side of Lake Ladoga, on the so-called dry land. They needed men, volunteers. For me, it wasn't a choice, it was a calling. Not a call of duty or patriotism, but a call from the abyss. The war owed me a death, and I was going to collect it. I traded my firefighter's overalls for a soldier's uniform that didn't fit. I traded my shovel for a Mosin-Nagant rifle, heavy and oily in my hand. I was assigned to a rifle division, composed mostly of young men like me, Leningrad survivors, militiamen, factory workers. Our faces were the same grey as the city we'd left behind. We were ferried across the lake on a moonless night, in crowded, silent barges. The dark, icy water seemed more welcoming than the land we were heading for. We landed in the swamps and dense forests south of the lake. It was the Volkhov Front, and the objective had a name, Sinyavino. The Sinyavino Heights, a small patch of high ground, transformed by the Germans into a fortress of trenches, pillboxes, and barbed wire. It was the key to breaking the blockade. It was there that war awaited me. The days leading up to the attack were a torture of tension. The humidity of the swamp seeped into everything. The air was heavy with the smell of rotting earth and the constant buzzing of mosquitoes. And the constant sound of artillery, a distant thunder that never ceased, making the ground vibrate beneath our feet. No one really slept. The men cleaned their weapons, wrote letters that would never be sent, smoked cheap cigarettes down to their fingers. Their eyes were bright with fear. My eyes were empty. I felt nothing. I was the calmest man in hell. And then the order came. In the early morning of August 27, the earth shook, a roar 1,000 times louder than any storm. It was our cannon, thousands of them, all firing at once. The sky to the east caught fire in a false, orange dawn. The air filled with shrapnel, whizzing overhead. The bombardment lasted 2 hours of a non-stop earthquake. And then, sudden silence, and a whistle. The officers whistled at its now. The collective cry, "Rah!" An ocean of men rises from the mud dot and run. I run. My feet sink into the sodden ground. Mud sucks my boots. The weight of the equipment, the rifle, the ammunition. It doesn't matter, just run. The air fills with a new sound. A buzzing. A tearing of fabric. It's the German machine gun. The MG-42s. Hitler saw. The man to my right. His name was Mikhail. He was a music student. He stumbles, he falls. There's no time to look. Don't look back, run. Mortar explosion. Showers of dirt, mud, and hot metal. The ground vomits. Drop to the ground, crawl. The smell of gunpowder burns your nose. The smell of blood. The barbed wire. A spider's web of men. Screams of trapped men, struggling, being mown down by the crossfire. An officer shouts, "To the left, advance, get up, run again." My breath is a knife in my chest, my lungs burn, my heart is a beating drum. But the ghost inside me is calm. It just watches. We're 200 meters from the first trench line, 200 meters of open ground. It's a slaughterhouse. We're being decimated. The attack is failing. Panic begins to spread. Men hesitate, seek cover. But there's a concrete pillbox on the hill, just ahead of us. A single machine gun is pinning us down, spewing death in methodical. If we don't silence, we're all dead. Our sergeant screams, aims at it, and a bullet hits his neck. He falls silent. Hesitation turns to paralysis, and that's when I stop running. I turn and look at the pillbox. It's the source of all the sound, of all the death, and I feel a tick-daughter call. It's there. My end is there, in that small, dark opening. I don't scream. I don't think. I just get up and start walking toward it. First walking, then trotting, and then running. Running straight into the fire. Tracer bullets whiz past me like red bugs. I should be dead 10 times, 20 times. But I'm not trying to live, and that's my armor. The other soldiers in the mud look at me like I'm crazy. Maybe I am. I reach for a fallen comrade's grenade pouch. 3 of them, heavy, round, like iron eggs. 50 meters. The sound of the machine gun is all there is. It's a roar that fills the universe. 40 meters. I can see the flash inside the opening. 30 meters. I pull the pin on the first grenade. The small click is the most intimate sound in the world. I throw it. It flies in an awkward arc. It lands short. The explosion throws me sideways. Shrapnel rips through my leg. The pain is an electric shock. It's the first thing I've felt in months. And it feels good. It proves I'm still here. I limp to my feet. I pull the pin on the second. I run a few more steps. I throw it. This time, it enters through the opening. The explosion is muffled. The machine gun's roar stops. A momentary, shocking silence descends over the field. I don't stop. I keep limping, running toward the trench that leads to the pillbox. I jump in. 2 German soldiers, their eyes wide with shock. One raises his rifle. Mine is faster. The recoil against my shoulder. The deafening noise. He falls. The other comes at me with a trench shovel. He swings it. I block it with my rifle. The impact reverberates in my arm. We're too close to shoot. He is strong. His eyes are blue. He's just a boy, like me. He grunts with effort. I push him back, swing my rifle, and hit him in the face with the butt. A wet sound of bone breaking. He falls. I lie there, panting. Sweat and rain mix on my face. My body trembles with adrenaline. And then, the cry of "Rah!" starts again behind me. My suicidal act has broken the paralysis. The rest of my unit advances, takes the trench, storms the position. We have won. We have taken the hill. I lean against the trench wall, slide down to the muddy ground. I look at my hands. They are covered in blood and mud. I look at the bodies. I look at the grey sky. And I feel nothing. No joy. No relief. No glory. Only emptiness. The ghost inside me is still there, and touch. It survived. The sound of battle returned with full force as the Germans began their counterattack. But for me, the fight was over. I won. I survived. And amidst that inferno of screams and explosion, I realized my curse. I could not die. The war had taken everything from me, and now it refused to take me too. I was left behind, in a silence that no artillery could drown. The silence of aftermath. The silence of aftermath. It's the part of war no one talks about. Poets write about the glory of the charge, historians about battle strategy, politicians about noble sacrifice. But no one talks about what happens when the last shot is fired, when the adrenaline fades and leaves you alone in a field of body, with the ringing of nothingness in your ear. The German counterattack came, as expected. The fighting for the Signuvino Heights continued for weeks, a ravenous meat grinder that devoured thousands of men. I fired my rifle, threw myself into the mud, followed order. But I was no longer there. The climax, that moment of suicidal rage, had emptied me completely. I was a functioning body, a uniformed puppet whose sole purpose was to wait for the strings to be cut. But they never were. A few days after that first assault, a mortar shrapnel found me. It wasn't a noble or dramatic wound. It was just a jagged, dirty piece of metal that tore through the muscle of my thigh. The pain was a fleeting relief, a reminder that I still inhabited a physical body. I was taken to the rear, to a field hospital set up in an abandoned school. In that place of enforced stillness, that the true horror of my survival began. The hospital was by no means silent. It was filled with the soft, constant sounds of suffering, the wet coughing of a man with gas-filled lung, the feverish groans of infection, the whisper of a doctor dictating a letter to the family of a boy who would never see the dawn. But for me, after the roar of the artillery, that place was a vacuum. And in that vacuum, the memories I had tried to bury beneath the noise of battle surfaced. Lying on a cot, staring at the damp patches on the ceiling, I couldn't see the faces of the Germans I'd killed. I couldn't relive the sickening thrill of the charge. Instead, I was back in the rubble of my home. It was dark, it was cold, and I could hear on your breathing. I could feel the concrete slab, still and mocking, beneath my bloodied fingertip. The sound of the machine gun in Signuvino was forgotten. The sound echoing in my head was that last, small sigh. The sound of the silence that followed. I become a hero for throwing two grenades into a bunker, but I couldn't move a piece of rock to save my sister. What kind of cosmic juke was this? Guilt was a physical thing, a weight in my chest that made it hard to breathe, a sourness in my stomach that was worse than any hunger. Why me? Why did I survive? I saw better men than me die for a stupid reason. I saw Mikhail, the music student who could quote Tchaikovsky, erased from existence in the blink of an eye. I saw 17-year-old boys, barely able to shave, die screaming for their mothers. And I, the ghost who sought death, who ran chest deep into the machine gun, was there, alive, with a clean leg wound and 3 hot meals a day. Survival didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like a punishment, a life sentence inside my own mind. I looked at the other wounded men round me. Some wept silently. Others told crude jokes, trying to dispel the darkness. Many just stared into space, their eyes seeing things only they could see. We were a brotherhood of broken souls, trapped in their own private hell. Today, in the silence of my apartment, almost 80 years later, it is in that field hospital that my mind lingers most. I still smell the antiseptic and gangrene. I still hear the moan. War, for me, is not the battlefield. It is that cot. It is the crushing loneliness of being surrounded by suffering and yet completely alone with one's own pain. The scars on my leg faded long ago, pale silver lines on the skin of an old man. But the other scars, the invisible ones, those still burn on cold nights. They remind me of the weight of the things left behind. A sister's laughter, a mother's touch, the dreams of a boy who wanted to build beautiful things and, instead, learned only to destroy. They gave me a medal for my bravery at Signuvino. A weary-faced officer pinned it to my hospital pajamas. For the motherland, he said, without conviction. I stared at the small piece of red and gold metal. It was a strange, alien object. It seemed like a bad joke, a piece of metal in exchange for a soul. When they discharged me, weeks later, I tucked it into the deepest pocket of my coat, and I returned to the war, no longer seeking death, but something much more difficult to find, a reason to live. I needed to understand why I had been left behind. What was I supposed to do with all that silence the war had given me? What should one do with all that silence? That was the question that haunted me. After the hospital, I returned to the front. The war continued for 2 more long, bloody years. I fought at Kursk, helped liberate Ukraine, marched through Poland. I saw the horror of Majdanek with my own eyes. And finally, I reached Berlin. I was there when the red flag was raised over the Reichstag. I saw the surrender, the celebration, the tears of relief in the faces of men who hadn't smiled in. For everyone, it was the end. For me, it was just the continuation of the silence. The external war was over, but the one raging within me had no armistice. I was a 23-year-old man with the soul of a centenary, carrying the ghosts of a sister, a mother, and a boy who once dreamed of being an architect. I returned to Leningrad on a train packed with soldiers. The city I found was a wounded shadow of itself, facades riddled with bullets, Entire buildings that had collapsed into piles of rubble, parks where trees had been cut down for firewood. It was my pain made visible, mirrored in a scale of granite and plaster. But amid the devastation, something was happening. A movement, a sound. The sound of shovels against rubble, the sound of hammers banging, the sound of voices. No longer whispers of hunger, but firm voices giving orders, planning, working. The people of Leningrad, the survivors, were not mourning. They were rebuilding. There was a fierce, silent determination on their faces, a refusal to let death have the last word. And it was there, watching an old woman sweeping the broken glass from the front of her ruined shop, that the answer to my question began to take shape. My old dream of becoming an architect seemed like a cruel joke. My sketchbooks had turned to ash along with my apartment. My hand, which once traced graceful lines on paper, knew only the roughness of a rifle and the texture of dried blood. But what else could I do? I joined one of the reconstruction brigade. The work was brutal. We spent entire days clearing rubble, carrying stone, twisting rebar, tearing down walls that threatened to collapse. It was work that exhausted the body and, therefore, quieted the mind. For the first time in years, I slept without dreaming. Sweat cleansed something in me that tears could not. I wasn't thinking about the future, nor the past. I was focused on the weight of the next stone, the balance of the wheelbarrow, the simple, honest task before me. About a year later, we were cleaning up the ruins of a school in the Vasily Ostrovsky district. It was melancholy work. We found pieces of chalk, broken inkwells, pages from children's books. One day, while breaking up a section of wall with a sledgehammer, something fell at my feet. It wasn't a stone. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, probably a student's art class project. I picked it up. It was light, fragile. It fit in the palm of my hand, and as I held it, the ice inside me finally began to crack. I remembered Anya, her dream of being a ballerina, her likeness. I remembered my mother, her patience as she mended my clothes. I remembered my father, teaching me that even the humblest worker has a purpose. This wooden bird couldn't fly. It was just a piece of wood, but it represented the attempt to create something. It represented hope. And I understood. Catharsis wouldn't come from forgetting, nor from dying. It would come from building. It would be my response to destruction. From that day on, my work changed. I enrolled in night classes. I studied engineering, masonry, everything I could about construction. The boy who dreamed of the beauty of facades gave way to the man who understood the importance of foundation. My life became an act of reparation. I didn't marry. I didn't have children. The place in my heart where a family should grow was sacred and haunted ground, forever theirs. But I built homes for hundreds of other families. I helped rebuild hospitals where new children were born. And eventually, my knowledge led me to a special work, the restoration of historic palaces and museums. The Hermitage, Catherine Palace, the same buildings I had designed before the war. With my own hand, I helped mend their wound. I helped bring beauty back to the world. Every piece of stucco I applied, every gold leaf I helped restore, was an act of defiance against the whistle of that. It was my way of saying that beauty and memory are stronger than hate. The silence never went away, you see. Grief isn't a disease you cure. It's a landscape you learn to live in. But I filled that silence. I filled it with the sound of saws and the smell of fresh wood. I filled it with the silent camaraderie of other men who also carried their own losses. I filled it with the purpose of leaving the world a little less broken than I found it. I rebuilt stone facades and marble palaces, but the real work was rebuilding a reason to breathe each morning. Every brick I laid was a prayer for those I lost. But even after a lifetime of building, there's one memory that remains like a broken foundation. The memory of that first day of silence, after the sea, when I was still just a hungry ghost digging in the ruins of a bakery. The memory of that metal box I found. I never told them what was inside. The time has come, because it was the contents of that box that taught me the final lesson, the most terrible and the most hopeful of all. The time has come. Come back with me, one last time. Not to the battlefield, not to the hospital, not to the construction. Return to that first day, the day the silence of the sieges and rive. I am but a 19-year-old ghost, skin stretched taut over my bone, eyes sunken and old in a young face. I kneel in the rubble of a bakery on Nevsky Prospect, and in my hand, trembling with weakness, I hold a small, rusty metal box. The air smells of coal dust and an end. The whole world holds its breath, waiting to see what remains of it. I pry open the lid with my bruised fingers. It gives way with a groan, and I look inside. There were no cookies. There was no food. There was only paper. Dozens of small rectangular cards, stacked neatly. They were bread ration cards, official, with names, addresses, and beneath them, folded neatly, a single piece of yellowed paper, torn from an accounting book. It was a letter, written with a thick pencil, the handwriting tight and nervous. It was the baker's confession. I read it there, amid the ruin of his life and his work. He wrote about how, that first winter, he watched his neighbors die, one by one. The old teacher from apartment 3, the young mother and her baby from apartment 5. He was in charge of the block's bread distribution station, and each day, when a family no longer showed up, he saved their car. The dead don't need bread, he wrote. And my children were alive. Their mouths were open each day. He used the dead's cards to get extra portion. He took them home to his wife and to young children. He kept them alive for months with the ghost's bread. But Gil, he wrote, was an acid. It corroded his sleep, his spirit. He saw the faces of the dead in his dream. He heard his children chewing and thought of the silence of the neighboring apartment. He couldn't take it anymore. He buried the card, the proof of his sin, under a loose beam in the basement of his bakery, hoping that by burying there, he could bury his shame. The letter ended abruptly. He never had the chance to redeem himself. A bomb found his bakery before deliverance could find his soul. I remained there, kneeling, holding that man's soul in my hand. Before me, a fortune. There were enough cards there to keep me, my mother, and Anya fed for a week. No one would ever know. It was the bread of the dead. It was survival. I looked at those names. They were people, like my father, my mother, my sister. People who waited in line, who felt the cold, who dreamed of a crust of bread. The baker, in his agony, had crossed a line. He had chosen his family over the community of the living and the dead. He had become something that hunger had forced him to be. And I, holding his legacy, stood at the same crossroads. I could use his sin to ensure my survival, or I could honor the memory of those nameless people by refusing to participate in that desecration. Hunger screamed inside me. It was an animal voice, logical and brutal. Take, eat, survive. But another voice, a much quieter voice, the voice of the boy who drew cathedrals, the voice of Ivan and Eleanor's son, the voice of Enya's brother, whispered. It whispered that there are ways to die that are worse than physical death. You can die inside and still walk. I looked at the cards one last time. I closed the metal box. I put it back in the hole I'd taken it from and covered it with bricks and dust. And I left, with an empty stomach, but with something in my chest that I wouldn't know how to name for many years. It was my soul, intact. Everything I did later in life, fighting in the war, rebuilding my city, restoring its beauty, was born from that single moment of refusal. Every survivor's story is a universe of secrets like that, full of terrible choices and small acts of grace that no one ever sees. Some, like mine, one day find the light. I look out my window now, once see the lights of St. Petersburg, a city that rose from its own ashes, a city I helped heal. I see life pulsing through its asphalt vein. I lived a long life. I saw man go to the moon, and I saw walls fall. But everything I am, everything I have built, is based on that single decision, made by a starving boy in the rubble. He chose hunger over shame,